First things first, let's get the wheel off. The hub cap, or the center cap I should say, you can pry off with a screwdriver or a pry bar, and then with a 22mm socket, take off all 6 of your lug nuts. And remove the wheel. In order for me to be able to move the caliper more out of my way, I'm going to disconnect this bracket here that holds the brake hose in place. Otherwise, all you have is movement from here to here, which is barely anything. So you can take a little pry bar or screwdriver and pry this ABS wire out of its mounting location. Just squeeze the tab. That should pop out. And with a 10mm socket, remove this bolt that holds the bracket on. A lot of times these break, so make sure you go slow. And now you can lift up this bracket. Perfect. From the back side, I'm going to take the caliper off of its bracket first, so remove these 2 T55 Torx bolts. So what's happening here is this bolt is actually the slider pin, and it goes all the way through, and it is seized in there. So what I'm going to try to do is, with a very pointy pick, pry the boot back, and I'm going to spray some rust penetrant in there to hopefully help break the slider pin free. And I'm also going to heat up this area here. When you heat it, make sure you point it away from the boot so that you don't melt it or damage it. It's still in good condition. Here's the issue. It's actually seized right here into the caliper because this still has grease. Resuming disassembly. This is now nice and hot, so set that aside safely. There we go. Since you have them out, go ahead and wipe them down and inspect them. You want to make sure they're not rotted or corroded. This one that was a little bit seized, I'm going to have to clean up in the wire wheel. And at this point, you can grab onto your caliper on the back side, just pry it towards you a little bit, or you can go in here and pry it like this. That's going to compress the piston just a little bit, so it makes it easier to take the caliper off. And there we go. It was a little stuck, but it came off with a little bit of prying. Set this aside. I like to put it on top of the upper control arm. That way it's not putting any pressure on the brake hose. And of course, make sure you're not pinching this ABS wire. Okay, you can tie it with a bungee cord too if you'd like. Next, get the pads out. With an 18mm, remove this bolt here and that one up there. That's going to remove the caliper bracket from the knuckle. Take this off, remove the bolts, and remove the rotor. At this point, you can take a wire brush and clean up the hub surface. You want the new rotor to mount on a clean surface. I just realized it's a little bit oily and greasy, so I'm going to first spray it down. Clean that up, and then with a wire brush, I'm going to go in and just scrub it down. Basically, you don't want any rust chunks or rust buildup or even debris like this to interfere with how the rotor sits on the hub. If you have to use a little grinding disc to grind down large rust areas, then go ahead and do that. Just make sure it's nice and flush at the end. At this point, I like to apply anti-seize on the hub. That's going to prevent it from rusting in the future, but it also will prevent the rotor from seizing to it. The next thing I want to do is install the rotor backwards, and the reason I want to do that is so I can clean off the backside easier. They come coated with cosmoline oil from the factory so that it doesn't rust, so take some brake parts cleaner and just spray it down. Wipe all the oil off. Then you can take the rotor, flip it over and install it the right way, and clean off the front side as well. At this point, if you wanted to, you could put a lug nut on just to hold the rotor from flopping around. The next thing you want to do is clean off your caliper bracket. So take the hardware off first. This is now trash because your pads should come with new hardware. Inspect the boots, make sure they're not ripped, and these look like they're fine. So next I'm going to take my wire brush and brush all of this rust off. So just make sure you clean this off very well. If for some reason you have such severe rust that you cannot clean it properly, you can use a little grinder and just grind off some of the surface material. But this looks like it's decent, so do the same to the other side. Rinse it off with some parts cleaner. Now in here, you could use a bore brush and some brake parts cleaner and clean all that off. But for me, there's still some good grease in there. I know I thought one of my sliders was seized in here, but it actually was seized on the thread. So this still had a little bit of grease. If yours was rusty and dry, then you would want to put a bore brush in there. In my case, I'm just going to add just a little bit of grease right in there. Work that grease right into the grooves of the boot. It's going to be like a reserve of grease, and the rest of it I'm going to put on the slider pins, but I'm not going to grease them up until they're ready to go in, otherwise it's going to get grease all over. So leave this as is for now, and the next area to grease up is right here where the hardware is going to sit. Just a very thin layer. You don't want a whole lot, but you want to prevent rust from building up like it was building up before between the hardware and the caliper bracket. Now, once that's greased, take your hardware, and as you can see, they're side specific. So there's a larger flat area and then a smaller one, and they can only go on one way. So pick the correct ones, press them on all the way. Do the same to the other side. I've cleaned up the caliper bracket bolts on a wire wheel because they had old thread locker on. If you want to put thread locker on, go ahead. Definitely do not put anti-seize. I've seen that happen, and that's not good. So install the caliper bracket next. And again, if you wish to put thread locker on, go ahead. Start them on so that it can hold the bracket in place. While I'm at it, I'm going to bottom them out and then torque them to 129 foot-pounds. Slide in your new pads. Find the right angle. Sometimes they're a little tricky to get started on here. There we go. Perfect. Make sure they slide easily. If they don't, that means you have too much rust on here and the pads are getting squished together, and that's not going to be good because they're going to stick to the rotor and you're going to have braking issues. Next, let's get on the caliper. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to bring the caliper over. Always inspect it for damage here on the pistons. These look fine. They are not leaking, so that's perfect. And in order to compress the pistons, I'm using this tool. You can also use a big C-clamp or anything else that you might have. But basically, you want to press both of these pistons in, make sure they go in smoothly. Okay, these should slide in smoothly. If they require a lot of force, that means the caliper is starting to seize up on you. So release that. Now I'm going to take just a little bit of brake grease, add it to the ring, outer ring of the pistons, and that's going to allow the brakes to operate quietly and smoothly. It also creates a seal for water to get into there. Sometimes it rusts the pistons out from the inside out. So also apply it to the 3 ears on the caliper here. Now take your caliper, flip it over, line it up with the pads and the bracket. Make sure your boots are not bent like that. Put them into place. And what I'm going to do is put one pin in just to hold it. While that one's in, I'm going to grease up this one. Make sure you put grease right on this ridge here. That's where the boot will seal up, and it's important for it to be greased. That way it makes a good seal, prevents water from going in. Now you can put this one in, start it on, and then take this one out, grease it up as well, slide it in, and bottom them both out. Torque these two to 80 foot-pounds. One last thing to do is to put this bracket back on. Perfect. Now let's get the wheel on. Go ahead and put the wheel on. Start on all of your lug nuts, bottom them out, and torque them to 140 foot-pounds. And of course, don't forget the center cap.